Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly McCoy of the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker. I'm one of the DataWorks co-chairs. So on behalf of NASA, I'd like to welcome Dr. Elisabeth Paté-Cornell as your next keynote speaker. She serves as a member of the NASA Advisory Council. She is the Burt and Deedee MacMurtry Professor in the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University, a department which she founded. She was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1995 and currently co-chairs the National Academies Committee on Methods of Analysis of Risk of Nuclear War and Nuclear Terrorism. She is past president and fellow of the Society of Risk Analysis and fellow of the Institute for Operations Research and Management Science. Recently, her research has centered on failure risk of cyber systems and artificial intelligence and risk management decisions. She is considered one of the world leaders in engineering risk analysis and risk management. Please welcome Dr. Paté-Cornell.
Good morning. I'm Elisabeth Paté-Cornell, and it's a pleasure to be here and to see you. Now, my talk is going to be a bit different from what you have just heard. It's going to be very practical. Yes, that works. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cyber attacks, cyber risk, and the role of artificial intelligence to make it work. And I want to say that this is the work that I've done with several of my doctoral students, generally from the US Army. So you're going to see how that works. So my outline, I'm going to talk about cyber risk assessment and risk management, and then I'm going to give you some real examples of studies. One is a statistical analysis of a database that I got from JPL. The other one is a risk management with a probabilistic Bayesian model using artificial intelligence in the warning and management of cyber attacks. And then I will discuss the role of artificial intelligence in risk and decision analysis in general. So, basics of probabilistic risk analysis. I use probability all the time because I'm never quite sure about things. Identification of failure scenarios, explicit processing of uncertainties, either by statistics or Bayesian probability, the optimal risk management using decision analysis, the assessment of scenario probabilities and outcomes, dynamic analysis that includes games, and updating our information. The time horizon has to be consistent between the probability and the cash flows, and we assess the value of information, but again, signals, tests, etc., in probabilistic terms. And the goal is to improve our decisions. So, our cyber risk analysis method is quantitative. And by the way, it's not the only way to look at it. The alternative is qualitative risk description, guesstimates, etc. The main objectives are the best allocation of limited resources for specific organizations in the management of different types of attacks, and to assess the value of information that we're going to get out of that. So let me mention a few types of network cyber attacks that we have been looking at, particularly phishing, ransomware to hospitals, that was unfortunate, brute force attack, and deep fakes that are becoming more and more common. What is the focus of our cyber models? It's to assess the cyber risk, to decide whether the risk is acceptable. Sometimes we'll have to swallow it. To identify risk management options, to assess their risks and benefits, to set priorities given that we are not infinitely rich and days only have 24 hours, and to learn from experience. So, how do we quantify cyber risks? Well, we construct what we call risk curves. And the risk curves represent the probability of exceeding, in a time unit, let's say a year, different levels of losses. And we have used three ways to capture these uncertainties in risk results. One, statistical analysis when we have statistics and when they are relevant. Things have not changed that much. A probabilistic analysis based on scenarios, and we combine the two on the tail of the loss distributions. So what are the elements of our cyber risk model? What is the nature of the target organization, the ones that the bad guys are really trying to get? Hospitals versus space companies, for example. What is the information that we want to protect? Financial, technical specs? What is the structure of the system? You would be amazed at the number of organizations that have no idea of the structure of their system. So you hope that the people who have designed that system have not disappeared. The potential adversaries. What are the most likely bad guys that are interested in you? Governments versus individuals. What are the consequences of a successful attack? And the analysis of information, as I said earlier, for known attacks, statistics, when we have them, otherwise structured Bayesian network to model potential attack scenarios. So next step is the risk management, cyber risk management. What do we do next? So the key concepts are uncertainties, dependencies, and preferences. What kind of risks are you willing to take? And it focuses on the quality of the message. And again, the quality of the message, for me, is the probability of errors of both types. So the value of information depends on the signals. And the decision is to gather information. And the risk management decisions are based on that information. Example of options, for example, disconnection of some computers and a few other things that are listed here. And the value of the signal information is the improvement of the risk management decision, that is a decrease of the expected disutility of the cost of outcomes. Okay, then I'm going to show you two vignettes, two examples designed by my students. One is a statistical analysis of a large database that was given to me by NASA, routine cyber attacks and countermeasures, and that's the work of Marshall Kuiper, and I wanted to name him. Then the second one is warnings and management of cyber attacks. It's an AI-based probabilistic model of collaborative risk management between a robot and a human expert. And the question is, do we leave the doors open, or do we close them to cut the kill chain being the steps, the steps in the attack, the cyber attack by the bad guys. Okay, and that's the work of Colonel Isaac Faber, who is now at Carnegie Mellon. Okay, let's start the first one. Empirical analysis of past incidents and extensions to new attacks. We have two distinct kinds of cyber attacks, the operational, routine attacks, and the destructive ones that may not have happened yet, so we don't have statistics, but threaten the organization and require an in-depth analysis of the attack scenarios. So here is the shape of the statistical database that was given to us, and there was about 60,000 incidents over 6 years of various routine attacks, for example, lost and stolen computers. Don't lose your computers, that's not a good idea. And so the size of the bubbles that you see here are just the costs of that attack when it was successful, which it was. So let me give you examples of the routine attacks we looked at in what we call Space Corp. Email intrusion, website attack, and lost and stolen computers that I mentioned. What are the sum of the costs of the successful attacks? Well, your loss of intellectual and physical property, and also your business interruption. The countermeasures that you have seen, I'm sure, involve the known firewalls, etc., but particularly two-factor authentication and data loss protection, at least in the organization that we talked to. What does the effectiveness of these countermeasures depend on? The structure of the system attacked, the type of attacks, and insiders, of course, as you know, are one of the most destructive types of attacks. The sophistication of the attackers and the AI learning for the defender, and the ease of implementation. I'm not going to put a 16-character password and require that you use them. And let me show you the kind of results that we obtain, the risk curves. For each of those, it's the probability that different costs are exceeded in a given year And for these, we looked at all kinds of different kinds of cyber attacks by email, malware, data spillage, website, lost devices. And for example, you can see here that the problem that we have when we use statistics is what's happening on the tail of the distribution when we don't have statistics. That's where we need some scenarios, and we need to work with scenarios. And as you can see, the loss from compromised websites are usually small. That's the purple one. But they can be huge. That's why we want this upper limit. And here is how we computed it. That's the most difficult part. Some elements come in a statistical model because it's in the lower part of the costs. So the loss of computers enters there, that category. Then, so we have statistics, and we can construct that curve. Then, at the end of that curve, we need scenarios. And for example, in that space companies, what will happen, what cyber attack can make us lose our whole mission. And for that, we need scenario models of new possible attacks. So what were the takeaways? We finished that study. It was very well received. What are the takeaways here? That cyber risk quantification can be done, and it takes a statistical combination of statistical analysis and scenario analysis with Bayesian probability. Turns out the rate of attacks here was relatively constant, and the countermeasures effectiveness can be assessed and compared. And in this case, full disk encryption and two-factor authentication were the most effective. And now for something entirely different. That's the work of Colonel Faber. And the question was the warnings and the management of the risk of cyber attacks. To generate early signals of attack threats using artificial intelligence, and to give the information for a hybrid team of decision makers. And that hybrid team is two things, of course. A super expert, which is a robot, and a human expert, and I'm going to show you how the two interact. What we call a gate is one step in a kill chain. The robot learns from the operator and makes decisions, automatic decisions, to leave the circuit open or to close it based on decisions from the control software, but under uncertainty, of course. And so if you are making T-shirts and you have a big system that sells the T-shirt, you have two kinds of entries. You have the people who want to buy your T-shirts, and you may have the bad guys who want to get to your financial part. So the robot learns from the operator and makes decisions to leave the circuit open or to close it, and based decisions from the control software at each observed gate. Now the robot calls on the human experts when it is above its head. That is, when the uncertainties are too big, and when the outcomes can be too big, the losses can be too big. So why do they do that? To observe what is the optimal security policy in opening or closing the gates. So our research method was to develop machine learning techniques to build and deploy a global honeypot sensor array, because we needed to have some data, and we wanted to see how the bad guys were interested in what we were doing. So we put the honeypots up there, and we got a lot of answers, and I'm going to show you that. Then we studied the communication systems to issue these warnings, and we used an industry standard attack graph from Lockheed Martin. So it's their kill chain, reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery of the malware, exploitation, installation, command and control, and actions on the objectives. So the collaborative decisions were the signals threats generated by artificial intelligence, the collaborative decisions between the robot and the human decision maker, and we considered the effect of possible errors on the outcomes. That means leaving the gate open to an attacker and closing it to a legitimate customer who cannot buy your T-shirts. So the decision is based on utility function with a predetermined risk attitude encoded in the control system. I'll pass on this one. Let me show you the timeline of an attack. This is an example from the attacker's perspective of ransomware on a hospital. So about 4 weeks to probe for the vulnerabilities of the system, but 1 week to prepare the malware for the specific system, about 1 week to implement that malware. And then in minutes, we have delivering, exploitation, controlling the host, executing the attack, and maintaining the control. So this was ransomware on a hospital, which is most unpleasant for everybody, especially the people who are sick. So the basic concept here in behaviors and decision gates, our focus is on actors, the legitimate ones who want to buy your T-shirts, and the bad guys who want to enter your system for the wrong reasons. The behaviors give us data, and this means requesting entry and attacking or not. And we developed a gate policy to optimize the system value, opening or closing the gates, and to look at to minimize the expected disutility of the costs that are the loss of good links and the attack risks. Okay, now I'm going to show you what's happening inside the computer, and we have here a time axis at the bottom, from the left to the right. We have entry points at the left and outcomes on the right with an impact on my system that they are trying to get to. We can close the gates, and these are the ones, the solid lines, or we can leave them open, the lines between the space between two dots. So in blue, you have legitimate actors, and as you can see, most of them reach the core of the system, although one of them is caught at the end by the closed gate that was closed to prevent the threat activity. Now, the attackers go through a number of gates until they get stopped, with one exception, when the red line, in fact, does reach the core and can do all kinds of unpleasant things. So again, the steps are reconnaissance, weaponization, delivering, exploitation, control, execution, and maintenance. So we set up 18 honeypots just to see who was interested in us. And the system was set up to appear like an unsecured web server so that the attackers would be prompted to enter a username and a password, which allowed us to identify them and see what it is that they were after. We had about 600,000 visits, and the signals that we had, unique IP addresses, number on blacklists, number with multiple entries that are more likely to be the bad guys, and oh yes, I should tell you what's a honeypot. It's a cybersecurity mechanism that uses a manufactured attack target, and in our case, it was to lure the potential attackers and gather intelligence. And we put these 18 honeypots all over the world, just to see what we would get. Okay, so we observed the real-world behavior between the honeypots and a critical stack that we already had, which we updated with the information that we had gotten. We have now information that we can give to the operators, but that are also gotten by the bad guys, most of them. Geolocation of observed blacklist events, as you can imagine, China, US, France, and Russia. So learning and updating process was critical in all that. The raw data were obtained from the honeypots and used to update the information that we had gotten from our experience. The frequencies of attacks were used to identify the threats. The probability of threats were updated for each potential attacker with each event, experience plus new information. And the value of information was the improvement of the risk management decision, knowing that the tests and the messages that we got were all in uncertain terms. So here is the cybersecurity strategy in front of the hybrid team. The hybrid team, why is it that my robot has disappeared? Ah, there it is. The robot, the machine learning AI system, and the human agent. Now they send messages to the security stack that sends messages to the central database, and the central database also gets information from external information. Now what I put on the left side was the protection of the network. Proxies, intrusion detection systems, firewalls, and the internet with artificial intelligence. Now, what are the elements of the system? The security stack that collects a collection of devices to protect the organization. The external information is very important. It's a perspective that the human may have, and that's not in the AI system. For example, that another company was attacked, and that gives us new updating and new data. The central database is a big database that learns over time about attacks using internal and external information. Oops, no. Formulation of the decision model, we assume that the threats and legitimate requests arrive at the same gate. The superagent decides if the gate should be open or closed, but it's not entirely sure based on expected utility of outcomes. And opening and closing a gate is a decision on the part of the superagent. So we have active learning and decision-making and a human-AI trade-off. The robot makes decisions by default, and the expert makes the decision when there is little or low-quality data, too much uncertainty, too large a potential loss, and when it has enough time. Some of the gates require expert intervention for much longer until the robot becomes confident that it has enough data, and the assumption being that the system does not change. So let me show you how that dynamic AI learning works. This is to be read from the left to the right, and in red, those are decisions of the expert, in blue, decisions of the robot, and on the vertical axis, you have the gates, from 1 to 16 in this case. And in the beginning, it's the human who makes decisions, and the robot learns. Sometimes the robot learns very quickly, as in gate 13, for example. Sometimes it takes a lot more time, as in gate 3. But sometimes, as I show in the middle, the robot says, I'm above my head, and goes to the human being to make the decision. The human being makes the decision, and then the robot comes back. So this is the dynamics of the learning and decision-making in that team. More generally, I would say that AI has two different roles. One in the information stage, excuse me, I've flown too much. The information system observes the behaviors, assesses and updates probability, and communicates the result to the robot. Things become more complicated in the decision stage because you need to have a risk attitude at that stage. The robot recognizes its ability to make the decisions, and if not, again, passes the hand to the operator. The decisions from the robot are made based on an encoded risk attitude, which may or may not be the right one under the circumstances and needs to be updated. And that's a general problem of AI automatic decisions. I discovered it with my doctor. My doctor was looking at his AI database and was making recommendations. The AI database was making recommendations, for example, of this. I said, well, you've got to be kidding. That's not what I want to do. That's what the majority of the population that has fed this database has decided, but it's not mine. The same thing happens, and I describe it in a paper that I just published when doing in a sailing race, where people who are sailing, I'm a sailor, who get information from this AI system that tells them that the weather is much better out there when my boat or the boat was going to go that way. So then the skipper has to decide whether to follow what the AI system is saying or not. So one can use attackers' behaviors as signals. The two agents who make the decisions constitute a hybrid system, from the robot that follows the information and gives decision rules encoded in the databases, and for a human expert who makes decisions when the robot doesn't have the capabilities of doing it. And again, it's a general problem of AI automatic decisions. And by the way, it applies to the DoD. My husband was at the head of strategic command at some point and told me that you don't want to use these kinds of stuff without thinking very hard. My conclusions about cyber warnings and cyber analytics is that the perception of cyber risk is sometimes apocalyptic, and probably it should be. But the real question is, what do we do next? Risk and decision analysis bring some reality and rationality into that perception because they treat explicitly the uncertainties. Not always obvious, but essential. Sometimes communicating a result is difficult. My whole career has been in risk analysis on many different kinds of systems, including space systems. And explaining what you obtain probabilistically is not always obvious, but essential. So that requires understanding the system structure, starting there, accessing existing data sets of past attacks, including new data from AI, and learning which are keys to the relevance of the result and the effectiveness of countermeasures. And it is worth it. I tell you that, having done seismic risk, risk on offshore platforms, risk on risk on space systems, risk on medical systems. I tell you that doing that kind of analysis I found extremely helpful to make sure that the people who make decisions have all the information and know what we know and what we don't know very well so that they can make their own decision given that information. And I'm done. And I'll take all the questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
All right. It's a challenging question.
Okay.
So my question is related to uncertainties in terms of prediction, right?
Yes.
Now, one could make the argument that if you have an AI or a machine learning model, whatever you want to call it, you really just have one kind of instance of what could be an ensemble if the training data changes slightly, right? And so the question is, have you taken that into consideration, that if you change the training data slightly, then your model might have a kind of nonlinear difference as compared to the slight difference in the training set over?
Yes. Well, a good AI system will give you not a single solution or a single description of information, but a probability distribution, essentially. So I would not work with a single point, and if I get a single point, say, where does that come from? Can you tell me what were the uncertainties? And can you tell me what is the distribution? So a good AI system does exactly what you're talking about, and it gives me a notion of the uncertainties and the probability distribution of what I'm interested in.
Thank you.
There's a lady here.
Hi. I just have a quick question on the first study that you showed us where you're quantifying risk
The statistics?
using statistics and Bayesian statistics.
Yeah.
Is there, so you use more traditional frequentist model to quantify sort of the first half of the more frequent occurrences and then a Bayesian model for the second half. Is there a reason why you chose to use both instead of just, have you tested it with a Bayesian model for the whole thing?
Actually, that would be a very good idea, except that I didn't have to. Because I had so many statistics for the first part, the lower part of the distribution, that I did not have to tweak my statistics and make it more complicated. So I just used the statistics, but again, that's because I had enough information to do that. In the second part, I didn't have that information. So that's where I got into the Bayesian probability. And the interesting part was the overlap, where I got a lot of information, some coming from the statistics, some coming from my experts, but that allowed me to fill the gap between the two. But you're right. If the statistics are imperfect, incomplete, then I have to translate their information into Bayesian probability. It's a very good point.
Yes, hi, Lieutenant Colonel studying Avaltech Det 6. Two questions, but I think they're related. In your results, you showed the robot learning from the decisions it's making in closing these gates. Was there any analysis done on whether or not the decisions were the right decisions? Yeah. And the follow-up question is, what considerations were taken as far as how an adversary might be able to train that AI or condition it so that it allows them through?
Let me start with your second question. You have an excellent point, and no, we have not done it. And I know exactly how I would do it, but it would take a lot of information that I would get from the intelligence community, and it would be a lot more difficult than the first one. Now, the first part of your question was uncertainties, and the fact that the decisions that you make, that the robot and the human being makes, are not perfect. And we know that. So we represent in our risk cost, once we have decided of a gate policy, the risk curve, in fact, represents some of the errors that we make. The same is true for any warning system that I know and have analyzed. You have type 1 and type 2 errors, and your results should reflect these type 1 and type 2 errors. So you have an excellent point in this. And again, it's part of the results to show in the risk curves what are the uncertainties on my results. Did I answer your question?
I got one for you.
Yes, sir.
So you said somewhere in your presentation you hope that the person that understands the overarching system is there to be able to explain it.
No kidding.
I always found that to be the most informative, right? Just like peeling away the layers of all of the various pieces of that system that you put a bounding box around and understanding the linkages between all of those. That was done for a pretty simple thing, right? Like a T-shirt manufacturing company. But
could be very
it gets very complex. Like yeah. So when you do that and you're breaking down mission and then associate it with that kind of system and all the interdependencies therein, is there a standard way in which to be able to capture that? So I've been leveraging systems engineering to do that, mission engineering thing, but for that work that you were doing, did you capture that in some way?
The system structure. Well, the system structure gives me information about the value of what I get from those who have designed the system and tell me what are the chances of error. But let me give you a case that I have seen where they didn't have a measure of this. It was a water management system in the northeast of the United States, and the man who had designed their system had died. No one knew how the system worked. So they had, in fact, to reconstruct the system. And because they didn't have the information that they needed. So you go to the people who have done the system, you try to understand how it works, you try to understand the sources of error, and you put that in your probability. And that's why I always use probabilities. And that's what we do, for what it's worth. And the probability is only as good as our ability to assess the information that we get. No more questions? Well, I'll be happy to talk to anybody who wants to pursue the conversation with a cup of coffee, because it's very early on the West Coast. Thank you.